Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight is the Danny After Dark Book Club. And for this month, the month of May, it was voted on to read and review this book, which is in West Memphis, the West Memphis 3, and Another False Confession by George Jared. So this was one of the authors that I got to meet and pick up a book from him at the Beyond the Crime convention last month in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Actually, all the books that were on there were books for the poll of authors that I got to meet, as well as pick up their books in Albuquerque. So I'm really excited to read and review this book. I didn't read it before purchasing it, so it was very new to me. I'll be perfectly honest. In regard to the West Memphis 3, there seems to be even to this day, I think the best word I can think of is a divide in regards to who's on what side. Are the three men innocent? Are they not? So on and so forth. So in regards to if people have differing opinions on that about the case, we're not getting into that tonight. This is just solely a review of the author George Jared's book, as well as a kind of review of, you guys know I talk about structure and all that fun stuff. So like the nitty gritty of the way the book is put together. So we will talk about all of that. But before I do, if you are in the US, today is Memorial Day. So happy Memorial Day to everyone. And I hope you guys had a fantastic weekend. Quick hello to see who's here tonight. Beckham. Hi, Beckham. I am consciously trying to do it under 2 hours tonight, but we will see. Y'all know when I do a book review, I nerd out, and as long as my book reviews are, I could probably go another few hours. I just love to read and talk about books. It's like a blessing and a curse. I don't know. Hello, Kane, PJ Wolf, and shout out to PJ Wolf, who I got to meet in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the Beyond the Crime convention, got to spend some time chatting with, and so lovely of her to sit and watch when I did my live show there, which I know I still need to post. I still need to post that. It's on the list of things to do. But hello, everyone. So let's go ahead and dive in. I did pin a link to the StreamYards. If anybody has read the book and wants to come in and review it as well, you are more than welcome. If you have read the book, but being on camera is not your thing, totally understandable. Feel free to be in the chat, or if you just want to hang back and watch and hear what I have to say, whether you've read the book or not, feel free to do so as well. And this is what I really like about book reviews, and especially the book club book reviews, is this is a book that y'all voted for. So I really hope after the fact, if this is a book where you kind of wanted more information, and if this is kind of like the, gee, I was on the fence about purchasing it or not, hopefully that kind of helps in your decision. My motto when in doubt is always get the book. Just always get the book. And sadly, very sadly, I say that a lot. And that's why I have a lot of books. But there are worse things to do, right? Hey, Tony Stewart. Hello. Hey, y'all. James Watson. Yes, thank you, James. thank you. I appreciate you saying that. I know you're not even in the US, but thank you. Yes, absolutely. Shout out to all the veterans today. That is why there is a Memorial Day. So thank you for saying that, James. Okay. So the book is this, and then this is the back cover. So I'm going to read what the back cover says, but right away before I do that, book got a little messy there. There we go. That's better. So what I thought was pretty interesting is that the three men, so Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly are on the back cover along with, let me zoom in that for you, with the three victims. And I thought that was a very interesting artistic choice because you typically don't see that. And of course, I kind of right away read more into it, or tried to read more into it, whether or not that was the author's intent, because in my opinion, the three men that were convicted are innocent. That's just my stance on it. That will not influence in any way how I do the book review. So to me, having them on the back with the three murdered boys, to me shows all of the victims in this. But someone may respectfully disagree, and that's totally cool. But for me, when I saw that, I was like, okay, interesting artistic choice from the author. And this is how I actually take away from that. So, okay. But what does the back of the book say? So it says, the crescent moon is often referred to as the witch's fingernail. The image above is a real picture. Let me show that again. See that right there? Sorry for the glare. Is a real picture taken by NASA's Cassini spacecraft March 25th, 2015, as it circled Saturn. The moons, Titan, the largest, Rhea, and Mimas were photographed depicting a rare triple crescent in Saturn's night sky. Damien Eccles, top left, and two cohorts, Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly Jr., were convicted in the May 5th, 1993 killings of Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, and Stevie Branch. Prosecutors claimed a belief in the occult motivated the three teens to murder the 8-year-old boys in cold blood. And that's right there where the back description stops. And at first when I read it, I was like, okay, it seemed very abrupt. Where is the author going with this? But at the same time, I was like, where's the author going with this? I want to know where the author's going with this, so I'm going to dive in and read. So again, I wasn't sure if that was a specific artistic choice by the author, but I found that very interesting, the way it kind of stopped. So with that being said, I know typically I'll say, does the back cover, what's the description, reflect what will be on the book on the inside? This is a little bit different because it kind of leaves, I feel, the reader just shy of what is the book going to be about specifically, like the specific take on this case. And it doesn't say that. It just gives you the basics. So again, right away, my thought is also, depending on where you fall with this case, as I discussed earlier, whether you think the three men are innocent or not, before you purchase the book, you don't know where the author stands on this. Except for the cover where it says another false confession. So I will say that. But putting that aside, if you're strictly only reading the back cover, you're not sure. And I actually think that's a positive thing, because you're not going to be swayed by, I only feel this way about this case, so I'm only going to read books that lean that way, or vice versa. I think this is kind of open to, again, strictly by the back cover. Anybody can pick it up and see, okay, where's the author going to go with this? I want to learn more. So show us the pictures. Oh, the back of the book. Yes, let me show them again, Tony. One moment. So it has, sorry for the glare, the moon, the three men. Let me zoom in closer. Sorry for that glare. And then the three victims at the bottom. So that's the back cover. Thank you for asking me to reshow it. So the book was published in 2016. So it's funny because right when I saw that, I thought, okay, there's so much that has happened since, and that is true. But then I think there's not enough that has happened since 2016. So like in my mind, I felt very stuck of like, we've come a long way, but have we really with this case? So to each their own. That was just my opinion on that. But just for context, this book was copyright 2016. The book itself is 200 pages that is split into 7 chapters, and 7 pages of the book are black and white photos, and that is towards the end of the book. So let me just quickly, yeah. Some of these are photos that we have seen before. And some of these, I would say, are ones that I hadn't, or some that are specific to the author. Like, for example, that Johnny Depp one. That is specific to the author at the movement that was done to free the teens, which we will get into. So yeah, a lot of pictures with this case, as well as a good description of what those pictures are, so that if anybody is reading this, and even though some of these are very well-known photos, if you're not really familiar with the case and you're reading it and you see those photos, the author does a great job of explaining who they are, what relation they are to either the victims or the 3 teens that were charged in this case, so on and so forth. So I found that very good by the author to not only just show pictures that, well, gee, a lot of people know. No, let me do the extra to make sure that it is explained, every single photo in depth of what they are. Not every author does that. So it's very much appreciated when an author does make that choice to do that. Okay, Tony Stewart, causing trouble of already. I expect nothing less of you, hun. Okay. So before we even dive into the West Memphis 3 case, perfect timing. The other Tony, hello, good to see you, hun. So at the front of the book, there is 2 pages about the author himself, George Jared. And what stood out to me is that the reader should know that George Jared is an award-winning journalist. And so what he says about this case, as you go to read it more, you see he was not only just someone writing this case, he was very boots on the ground with this case. And that makes, to me as a reader, a really big difference. So what he says is, quote, "No journalist has covered the West Memphis 3 saga more extensively. Since 2008, Jared has written at least 50 stories detailing every aspect of the West Memphis 3 case. Jared has unprecedented access to witnesses, court documents, hearings, attorneys, judges, and others. That access included interviews with the convicted and an extensive interview with Damien Eccles on Arkansas death row," end quote. And right away, sorry for the loud motorcycles going by at this point, that is absolutely accurate of what the reader will be able to hear and read about a bit more as the book unfolds. So again, there are 7 chapters in this book. There is one little technical note, again, doesn't make or break it, but when I read through with a very critical eye, the way let me pull it up so you can see. All right. So as you can see, it lays out what each chapter is, right? There's just a little bit of spacing between chapter 2 and 3. There should have been just one extra space just so it aligns with the rest. Again, the smallest of details, I'm thinking no one else really even noticed that. But when it comes to like little things like that, I try to take note. There were really no other like kind of typing errors, if you will, that I noticed during the rest of the book, but that was the only thing I noticed. But nonetheless, I did notice it, so I just wanted to make a quick reference to it. So the prologue that is discussed at the beginning of the book, my note here is interesting artistic choice. Not everybody reads when there are, prologues or appendixes, things at the end of the book. I feel like some people just literally want the meat of the book, and that is it. So with that being said, when I saw the prologue that was here, I was like, okay, this is a bit interesting, and I'm going to show you. And right away, the author put a picture of who he is describing. So it's Rebecca Gould and her case as of the writing of this book. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't Google it to see if it has since been solved or not. But as of the writing of this book in 2016, her murder is unsolved. And there is a photo of her with her dog, which as an animal lover right away just kind of grabbed me. And I was like, oh God, you already got at my heartstrings. So I'm really glad that the author put a photo of her in the book, because right away when you see that, I'm just like, you can't skip over that. Like, how could you just skip over that? Now you see her and you're drawn in and you're invested. So on the one hand, I was like, okay, I'm curious what this prologue has to do with the remaining part of the book. But as you read it, it segues into the author's coverage of the West Memphis 3. You're like, okay, I see the connection and why this was put in this book. But I think at the beginning, if you kind of just grab it and see that, you're like, oh, that's interesting. Why is this here? But as I always say, read every part of the book, even the footnotes. I know not everybody does that, but oh my gosh, there's so much important stuff. And it always just adds more context. And sometimes some of the footnotes are actually so important where I'm like, why are they not even the main part of the book? But that's just my rant. Y'all already know that, how I am with books. Always read everything in there. So anyway, again, my note to that was the author really draws you in with this in the way he sets up Rebecca, her picture, in describing about her case, and makes you want to learn more about her and her case, which the author provides all of that to the reader. And what the author says is, quote, her case spurred my career forward, end quote. So right when that line really, really stood out to me. So yeah, I was just like, okay, all right, here's where we're going. I will not get a ton into her case. I really encourage everybody who picks up this book to read that, to find a little bit more about her, as well as to Google her and find out more as well. So a few years later, the author discusses that he was now at a different newspaper, and began working on the West Memphis 3 case. And that is where we dive in. So there are quotes at the beginning of each chapter. They are not related to the case specifically, but they tie in each theme of the chapter, as well as I feel kind of goes with the kind of case and back cover of like the crescent moon and whatnot. And I found each artistic choice of who the author quotes and what type of quote, I found it very, not only intentional, but very well placed. Like, for example, chapter 3, there's a quote at the very beginning by Plato. Quote, we can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light, end quote. But all of them are really, really good quotes and just really well placed within the book. Hello, Karen Diamond. I hope you are doing well tonight. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the book itself, chapter 1. So right away, the book starts with Pam Hobbs, and the author just, when I say jumps in right away, I mean literally right away, saying, quote, Pam Hobbs was about to have her last conversation with her only son, end quote. So as a reader, I was just like, okay, we are diving like full in immediately. Again, I think if you don't know this case, even just the basics, it might be a bit abrupt, but as someone who is a bit familiar with it, I'm not going to say I'm an expert by any means, but also someone who, as a reader, I like an author who's a straight shooter and just like doesn't sugarcoat things, just puts it out there. And so right away when I read that first line, I was like, all right, that's what I'm going to get from this author. I like that. So let's carry on. So for those who aren't familiar, I'm going to kind of talk a bit about the case as I work through the book, the chapters, just to give it context. To me, I'm doing just a very brief summary. The author does a much better job of laying out the case as it unfolds in real time in this book. So if anybody's saying, Danny, you missed this part of the case or you missed this part, don't worry. I'm just really giving the in a nutshell. As much as I would love to do like a 4 or 5 hour book review, y'all would hate me. I would love it, but y'all would hate me. So, Tony Stewart, I want to give you a star, but I know you don't like when I give stars. So I'm giving you a virtual star, a virtual hug and a heart star. So thank you. That I appreciate that. I'm an expert at book reviews and just sitting back and just reading nonstop. That's what I'm an expert at. Other than that, not very much else. So anyway, so Pam Hobbs and Stevie Branch. So let's rewind a little bit. Starts with the school bell ringing May 5th, 1993. Stevie wanted to ride bikes with his classmate and friend, Michael Moore. Meanwhile, Dana Moore, Michael's mom, watched Michael as he left to go play with his friend Stevie. So Christopher Byers, after school, decided to grab his skateboard and ride around. His dad, John Mark Byers, saw him in the road atop his skateboard. John had spanked him and for what he was doing, playing literally in the middle of the street with a skateboard, and made him clean the yard. And that was actually the last time John would see his son alive as well. And then the author makes sure to note that John Mark Byers adopted Christopher, which I feel like in any other case, you might kind of read that and be like, why is that such an important detail? It's a very, very important detail in this case. And I'm really glad that the author makes a point to kind of pause and let the reader know if they aren't familiar or remind the reader if they are. So 4:30 p.m., Stevie and Michael biked near to Christopher's, and he mounted Stevie's bike and they went off. The boys were spotted throughout the afternoon. 6 p.m., Dana told Dawn to go find her brother Michael for dinner. At 6:30 p.m., John Byers arrived home, but Christopher wasn't there. The family had plans to eat dinner at a restaurant, and John was pissed. So the family went out to just try to find Christopher. And John and Melissa Byers at that point had also stopped by Michael's house. Dana told them she had just seen them minutes before, but really wasn't sure where they went off to. Pam Hobbs was working and wasn't aware that the kids actually weren't able to be located by the other parents. So she was just, again, totally unaware of what was going on. By 8 p.m., after not being able to be located by their parents, that is when the parents realized, okay, our kids are missing. So John Byers was actually the one that contacted the police. Officer Regina Meek, around 8:10 p.m., arrived to take a report. Perhaps the boys went to Robin Hood Hills. It was a wooded area, and that's an area that the boys knew well, and there would be a lot of places for them to play and hide there. While Byers reported Christopher missing, Dana Moore approached the officer too and reported, hey, my son Michael is also missing. Note, the author makes the point to say that Michael's missing person report was not filed until much later that night. Officer Meek went to the Robin Hood Hills area, but there were a lot of mosquitoes that night, and it was so bad that she was actually inhaling the mosquitoes. So she abandoned the idea of entering the woods to search for the boys. Officer Meek received another call that a Black man had stumbled into a fast food restaurant in the area called Bojangles. He was bleeding heavily and was disoriented. He went into the women's restroom, attempted to flush several items down the toilet. His blood was all over the floor of that restroom, and he actually defecated on the floor as well. By the time Officer Meek arrived to Bojangles, the man had left. She didn't even go into the restaurant. She took the report from the drive-through window by the employees. And I'm reading that and I'm just like, What? I don't know. I don't know. I'm kind of just as stumped as you guys are for that, but nonetheless, that is how the report was taken. So 9:15 p.m., Terry Hobbs called police to report her son Stevie missing. So note, Terry didn't tell Pam that Stevie was missing, according to her later police interviews. When Pam was picked up after work by Terry, she actually noticed Stevie wasn't in the car, and that was abnormal. They had another child, 4-year-old daughter, and that daughter told Pam, quote, "Mama, we can't find him," end quote, when Pam asked where Stevie was. I can't even imagine what went through Pam's head in that moment. Just like for Terry to not say anything, like, and then the other child to say it that way. Like, again, my mind just is rushing with thoughts like, what? But nonetheless, Terry told Pam, "Don't rush to conclusions. Stevie's alive and he's probably just lost." I find that an interesting statement. Not just like, don't rush to conclusions. He's probably off with his friends, or he probably missed, curfew. He'll be back. Not, don't worry, he's alive, probably just lost. I don't know. Adding that he's alive thing, I'm thinking, why would you say that? Like, granted, as a parent, if you can't find your child, of course, your mind goes to like the worst possible things. But I don't know. I found that very interesting to say that. So now all the parents were aware of what's going on. The friends were aware of what's going on. Neighbors were aware of what's going on. And they all joined in the search effort for the boys. So a full police search was organized, but it was not organized until the next morning. It was the next day, 1:30 p.m., when Michael's body was found. It was nearby Stevie and Christopher's body that were floated in the creek. Police officers retrieved the boys' clothing, and that was also in the creek. It was evident that the boys were bound with black and white shoelaces. Officers at the scene reported there was blood in the water, but none on the ditch bank. Very interesting, right? Right away, law enforcement circulated a name that they thought of someone that could be the culprit, 18-year-old Damien Eccles. Although there was no real evidence processed in the case that, and we're gonna talk a lot about that, right? Law enforcement believed that Damien was the primary suspect. They even interviewed him at his home on May 7th, 1993. A month into the investigation, Damien was arrested along with his friend, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, and then 17-year-old Jesse Miskelly Jr. The 3 teenage boys were charged with murder. Law enforcement believed that Michael, Stevie, and Christopher were sacrificed in a satanic or an occult-like ceremony. Here in the book is where the author then educates the reader about Damien specifically. And I really like how the author does that. So let me rewind. The author educates the reader not only about the 3 boys who were the victims in this murder, but also the 3 men who were charged with this. I feel like not every author makes the time or the artistic choice, I should say, to give equal opportunity to all involved. A lot of books are very one-sided, very... when I say victim focused, I don't mean that in a bad way, because that's the way true crime should be done. But sometimes it's focused so much on the victims, but not so much the acts of the offenders that led to it. And I'm not saying like, let's, for example, go 100 pages into Ted Bundy in a book when we're trying to talk about one of the victims. That's not what I mean. I mean, giving a gist about it, but why there's a connection is super important. And there's not always that balance. Or on the flip side, and this is, again, where true crime as a community is changing for the better. Sometimes, and I'll just use Ted Bundy as an example, there's a whole book about him and then maybe only a paragraph about the victims. And it's just very off-sided. My point in this is I feel the author does a really good job in discussing everybody in this book. Not even just the 3 boys, then the 3 men, but the family members as well. Everybody gets a really good part in this so that the reader really understands all of the people that are intertwined within this case and why, which is very helpful at the beginning to then see kind of where everything leads throughout the book. So I just wanted to make that note here that I have, that the author does a really good job educating the readers about everybody involved in this case. And at this part in the book, like I said, is where we get more into Damien specifically. So in a nutshell, he was a high school dropout who dabbed in the occult. According to a juvenile officer, he wore a black trench coat, had long black hair, and enjoyed horror books. And there were also rumors that he drank animal blood. Around the same time, so we all have heard of this little thing called satanic panic, right? That had now infiltrated its way into West Memphis. And law enforcement believed that Damien Eccles was their leader. The author makes it a point to say at this part that Damien admitted he played a game with law enforcement early on during this investigation, but Damien playing this game nearly cost him his life. And this is things that we have heard with Damien, who's done interviews since, or, you know, published things since. And on the one hand, like, as a reader, you kind of first are like, well, why would you do that? And that's a fair a kind of conclusion to jump to, but that's just that. It's a conclusion to jump to. Damien's also a kid. Like, when someone's 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, like, yes, you're legally an adult, but you're a kid. You don't know the ramifications of what you're doing at that age, especially if in his mind he's like, well, I didn't do anything, so I'm just gonna play this game. And it was a really bad game to play. But I don't fault him for being that young in making that choice that he did. And especially where Damien has had a lot of time to reflect on that and realizing, like, that did not serve me well, to put it very lightly. Anyway, the author adds, and this is one thing that I didn't know, and I made that point to say, I didn't notice. The chief juvenile intake officer was actually forced to resign from his office years after the murder. He had been using thousands of taxpayer dollars to buy guns, computer equipment, and other personal items. So again, find that very interesting in regards to someone saying, well, to me, that doesn't make or break the work this officer did in the case. Okay, fair enough. But to me, it says a lot, because if you're corrupt at your job and what you do, and corrupt as a person, how am I going to have faith in you to be fair to everybody else? But that's just me. Keep in mind, I come from Boston, and there's a lot of police corruption, and that little thing called the Karen Reed trial. Yeah, just that. So we are very questioning of law enforcement, and not for a good way. But yeah, so when I read that again, I'm really, really glad the author put that in there. I did not know that fact before I read this book. So to me, it spoke volumes. But for other readers, it might not. To each their own. James, I knew that would get your attention. If you started to drift at all, I knew saying Karen Reed would rope you back in. So mission accomplished. So if everything about the teenagers killing these 3 young boys were true, it would have been the first documented satanic related killing in U.S. history. Which, when you read that, when the author points that out, it's like, that's an excellent point to make. Like, excellent point. There were so many false, oh my gosh. We could do a whole show on satanic panic and the accusations that were made, and even a lot of the devastation that those accusations still cause people outside of this case. But I'm really glad the author makes it a point to say that specifically, because it's like, okay, wait a minute, there's a lot to this. So during an announcement regarding the arrest on June 4th, 1993, lead detective was asked how sure he was that the teens committed these murders on a scale of 1 to 10. That lead detective said, quote, an 11, end quote. And this is where we learn that before the arrests were made, Jesse Miskelly Jr. confessed to police. The prosecution's case was that the three teenagers, Damien, Jason, and Jesse, were drinking alcohol in Robin Hills Road when the three young boys approached. Jesse's false confession in regards to telling police told that a savage attack occurred. The boys were beaten, choked, tortured, and sexually assaulted. Jesse even said that Jason used the knife and cut off Christopher's penis and testicles. And Damien, in regards to him, he sodomized one of the boys. So Jesse Miskelly, we then learn a bit more about him and his confession. And his confession had a lot of inconsistencies to the story itself, but as well as to the evidence of the crime. His confession tape, when they did reach the trial point, it was played in court. So the author references Dan Stidham. So he was Jesse Miskelly Jr.'s attorney. If y'all have been following a lot of my book reviews, I actually did a review of that book. I do have it over, not on that shelf, on that one. It's an excellent, excellent book. And I'm really glad that the author here, George Jared, references Dan and references his work in the case. So again, if somebody is really into this case and wants another perspective of the case, Dan Stidham's book, excellent, excellent. I love how I point like as though you guys know where it is on the bookshelf, but excellent book. So Damien and Jason, they had a trial that was separate from Jesse Miskelly. The book goes on to describe in detail all three trials. I will not go into that in depth here, but just know that the author does that and does a really good job doing that. So even though DNA and forensic evidence didn't tie Damien, Jason, or Jesse to the crime, in the end, as we know, they were all found guilty, and Damien was actually sentenced to death. That all changed in 1997 with an HBO documentary called Paradise Lost. From there, a movement was started to free them. And the author makes note in this that his knowledge of the West Memphis 3 case was actually limited before he started to cover it. And I'm really glad that the author pointed that out. And I do feel, based on different things that the author says throughout the book, as you're reading it, you kind of do get that perspective that he wasn't, I don't want to say privy because that's not the right word, but he wasn't fully enmeshed in this and then kind of started writing where he would have already had a very skewed perspective on the case. He started to write about the case kind of again as it unfolded, as we're going to come to learn, very boots on the ground. And I found that very, very, very enlightening as a reader. And then there are other quotes that I'm going to get to that the author says that I think are very, very profound in regards to what I'm discussing now, that he actually says later in the book. So stay tuned. But I think it really ties in very well to what he's making note of now. So what the author says is, quote, "What happened to the three little boys is unimaginable. What happened to Damien, Jason, and Jesse is unforgivable. The trials were tantamount to a witch hunt, and Michael, Stevie, and Christopher deserved much better than that. The true killer or killers should be brought to justice," end quote. So right away, as a reader, you're like, okay, I'm now learning where the author kind of sits on this. If you weren't kind of sure what side the author was on, now you're really getting, with that quote, all right, here's where it's going to be. And that's fine. And that's fine. With that being said, I will say there are a lot of books, oh God, so many of them, way more than there should be, that, I mean, every author has a narrative or a point to the book that they're making in an opinion to it. And that's okay. As a reader, I don't mind your opinion in it. I like to also hear the facts and kind of follow along organically. It's when authors, and I don't want to book shame. Of course, there are two that come to mind. And if you've been watching this channel for a long time, I'm sure you know what cases those are referring to. But where the author kind of overly makes their opinion known, where it will say, for example, and then this occurred, that figures, and then the trial went here. Of course it did. Like those little extra little comments where it's like, no, I don't need that, author. I don't need that. Just tell the story. I know where your heart lies and what your opinion is on the case. Just tell the story. Long story short, the author does not do those extra little things. Here's where you're like, okay, here's where the author stands. But then the author goes back and you can tell his career working at a newspaper agency and reporting really serve him well to kind of take that step back to write the story. And I was very, very impressed by that, because right when I read this, I'm like, okay, now I know where the author stands, if I didn't already before, which I already knew because I talked to him at the Beyond the Crime Festival. But either way, I went into this book with just a clean slate, and I was really glad that the author just really stuck to the story as opposed to just like interweaving his opinion every other paragraph or whatnot, which some books do. And when they do, it drives me crazy. I always make it a point, long story short, to point this out because I'm so appreciative when authors just, here's my opinion, but let me remove myself a bit now and go back to the story. Excellent, excellent. So thank you, George, for that. Much appreciated as a reader. All right, so let's jump back. So the author goes on to say and explain in detail there were witnesses who testified at the original trials, but they have changed their stories since. And that is something that is going to be brought up throughout the book as it kind of unfolds and who those witnesses were. And I say witnesses with loose quotations, what they first testified to and then why they recanted. But anyway, the West Memphis 3 case, it re-entered the author's life in April 2008 while he was a journalist in Northeast Arkansas. Again, he says not knowing much about this case, he spoke to Jennifer, and when speaking to her, the author had said Jesse's confession helped direct show his guilt, and Jennifer suggested he read it. When the author later read it, he was dumbfounded. The author says he always admired Dan Stidham. The author talks about as well Jesse Miskelly in regards to his relationship with Damien and Jason, as well as his interactions with defense attorney Dan Stidham. In law enforcement, the confession that was given was filled with errors. And one of the things that is really heartbreaking in regards to Jesse, quote, the dead boy's image scared him, end quote. It just, again, that's kind of when law enforcement were showing him those photos to get that confession. So the author during the trial was able to catch Dan Stidham in the parking lot once, and Dan had told George Jared, the author, directly, quote, they are absolutely innocent, end quote. The author says once the witnesses finished testifying in the trial, he doubted the confession that Jesse gave was authentic. Quote, the West Memphis 3 might be innocent, end quote. But the author was very torn, and I'm really, really glad that the author takes this point to say he couldn't fathom that police and prosecutors would knowingly try to convict innocent people. And again, we're not talking 2026. We're talking 1993, 94, 95, 96, like that type of time frame of when the murders happened to when the trial happened. So there was a few years in between, but nonetheless, and I'm really glad that the author says that, because I feel like at that time, that would have been the view of so many. And it would have been a really tough stance to have, because on the one hand, you're like, okay, if law enforcement, prosecutors, police, all of those involved would try to knowingly convict these 3 innocent men, could they and would they have done that to others? And that's a scary thing to think about. That is a really scary thing. And I have a note here, and this is just my own personal question to the author is, I wonder what George Jared's viewpoint is on that now. And again, I know where you live, if that has an impact on this. I mean, again, me being in Boston, where there's a lot of corrupt law enforcement and police and state troopers, and I kind of grew up with that here. Like a statement like that, like, yeah, could police and law enforcement prosecutors knowingly try to convict an innocent man? Like, from a child's age, I'm like, yeah. But I also grew up next to Salem, right near Salem, Mass. So the witch trials, right? It's just like, well, yeah, that obviously that happens. That's been happening for decades upon decades upon decades. But I wonder, again, the author lives in a very different area. Arkansas is very different than Massachusetts. And I just wonder if the author, with seeing how, again, the true crime community has evolved and so much more information about cases, we have access to it, and especially with the role of social media in real time, I just wonder the author's viewpoint on that now, and I know it might be a very simple answer of, yeah, there are some are good, some are bad. I don't know. But I just was very curious when I read that statement just really stood out to me. And I understand why the author said that at that point in time from where he was. And I can't even imagine, again, the kind of internal struggle of that. So anyway, the author then discusses another point that led him to the conclusion that the three men might be innocent of the crimes. So there was testing done. We jump a little bit ahead. So 2007 genetic materials and hairs found at the crime scene were tested, and they actually all excluded, let me repeat that, excluded Damien, Jason, and Jesse. However, the results were most likely a match to Stevie's stepfather, Terry Wayne Hobbs. Again, remember how I mentioned at the very beginning of the book that Stevie was adopted by Terry? So when I mentioned keep that in the back of your mind, it's going to come up throughout the book. This is another one of those examples where it's coming up. It will come up again, but just keep that in the back of your mind. So I think this is actually worth repeating, so I'm going to repeat it. The 2007 genetic materials and hairs found at the crime scene, they all excluded Damien, Jason, and Jesse. The results were most likely a match to Stevie's stepfather, Terry Wayne Hobbs. Another hair that was recovered on a tree stump near the dump site probably belongs to David Jacoby, and he was actually close friends with Terry Hobbs, as we learn. So Dr. Werner Spitz, he was a renowned forensic pathologist. So he has a role in this case, in this trial. I feel like if you are into true crime, you know of Dr. Spitz. I mean, again, the author says renowned. I feel like that word is almost like putting it lightly, but nonetheless, that was a very accurate word that the author chose. So prosecutors argue the defendants used knives or sharp objects to attack the victims. Dr. Spitz refuted this theory outright, saying the cuts, abrasions, and other wounds sustained by the boys had actually been caused by animals and was caused post-mortem. So Dr. Frank Peretti also testified at the original trials that a sweater knife may have caused numerous wounds. Dr. Spitz argued it was inconceivable that a large serrated knife caused the injuries. Quote, they all died from drowning. It's not an opinion, it's a fact, end quote. I know Tony Stewart, right? Mind-blowing that could happen. Now I'm at my favorite spot at Courthouse Square. Nice, Tony Stewart, nice. So this also contradicted the confession by Jesse Miskelly that he gave to law enforcement. This is where the author discusses, oh my gosh, it's definitely a Monday night, discusses quite a bit about Dr. Spitz, which I found so helpful because as a reader, I was already familiar with him and what his role is in the true crime um, kind of community, if you will. And that's really not the right wording to say, but you know what I mean. But if you don't know him, his career accomplishments, or his role in this case, that is super, super helpful as a reader. So I'm really glad that the author doesn't just gloss over, here's an expert who testified, here's what he testified, now let's move on. No, 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 no. Like I said earlier, excuse me, the author does a really great job of going over every person that is tied into this case and giving kind of like an equal opportunity for a description of them and really not glossing over anybody. I found that super, super helpful. Okay. The author then goes into the whereabouts of Damien, Jason, and Jesse the day of the murders, as well as what witnesses testified to the timeline of where those men were when they took the witness stand during the trial. Again, we've already touched upon that there were witnesses that recanted what they said, but at the same time, we have to kind of start with what did they say at the trial, these witnesses, so then we know what they recant down the road and why they recant, because some of them do give, here's why I said what I said, which is super, super important to this case. I mean, I can't even make that as big of a thing as it is. It's super important to this case. So Jesse's name was actually being written in a police officer's notebook at 5:30 p.m. at the Lakeshore Trailer Park. Witnesses claim he went to a wrestling match actually later that night in Dyers, Arkansas. Damien and Jason, they lived in Lakeshore. Neither of them had a license and actually had ever even driven a car. And this was more than 6.5 miles away from the crime scene. So the author just doesn't say these things and then step back and move on to something else. The author does a really good job of saying, let's break this down. Could the men, West Memphis 3, Damien, Jason, Jesse, walk 7 miles each way, kill and rape these 3 little kids, scrub the scene, and return home, all within a 3-hour time frame? Excellent job pointing that out. Robin Hood Hills is actually no more. And this was something that I didn't know. The author goes on to say that a hotel now sits in its place, and the spot where the boys drowned is actually a parking lot. The author went to this area and described what it was like when he got there. And I have it over here. Great that he went there to put into context one of my favorite parts of the book. So I love when an author or somebody involved in a case doesn't just write about it from a distance, when they do their due diligence to go the extra mile, to go to these locations and report on it, what is similar, what is different, and just really go into detail. It's so helpful as a reader. I've never been to Arkansas, so I've never been to any of the locations that have happened in this case. Robin Hood Hills is actually no longer there. There's now a hotel. But nonetheless, the author who's from Arkansas, give that personal and, again, boots on the ground recollection and description in his book. Not everybody can do that. And I found that actually very helpful. So one of my favorite parts, because he's not just saying, here's what I see. He's taking it all in like, it's almost like in real time, you're reading like what's going through his mind being there. No, like seeing everything, putting it into context. Super, super helpful as a reader. Loved that part of the book. So the author actually gets personal when he discusses Michael's autopsy photos and how much it haunted him the most, because he has a son who has a very similar resemblance. And I found that just it really grabbed me as a reader when it's like, okay, like the author is very, very good at kind of distancing himself from a lot, reporting on the case. Yes, he has, as everything's unfolding. Keep in mind, we're reading this how many years later, and we know so much more than we know now, but the author's kind of reporting in real time. Here's where things unfolded. Here's where his mind was at, so on and so forth. And being very factual. And then when the author says, this part haunted me because I have a son that had a similar resemblance to one of the victims. It's just like, it just really grabbed at my heart in that area. Just like, okay, because the author wouldn't be the only one to kind of have the case grab you the way it does and make it very personal of, other people in that community. They had kids that age. Maybe their kids played in that area, so on and so forth. There's so many that really make those personal connections, why so many of these details could haunt them for personal reasons. And for the author to, I feel, get vulnerable with the reader and make that, it was just a very quick statement, but it really made me pause and be like, okay, I author George Jarrett, I hear you. So now we get to Dr. Michael Baden. So y'all know I'm a huge, huge fan of Dr. Michael Baden, and I own, I believe, every single one of his books. I've read them. I've reviewed them on this channel. I'm just a huge fan of Dr. Michael Baden. And why I'm fangirling about him right now is he has a lot of experience. He has a lot of experience. And when he says something, I really listen and I take it to heart. And he's somebody I have full faith in when he arrives at a conclusion. So learning, again, as a reader, if you are not familiar with this case and knowing that Dr. Michael Baden was involved and actually took the stand, he's a big deal. He's a big, big deal. And what he says should really be looked at. So now that I'm done fangirling over Dr. Michael Baden, what did he say on the stand? So he actually backed up Dr. Spitz's claim that the postmortem animal predation was caused by, is what caused the wounds on the boys. The author goes into a lot more detail about what Dr. Baden testified to. I originally had all of that in my notes when I was doing this review. And then I'm like, Danny, let's not make it a 5-hour review. And everybody knows how you feel about Dr. Michael Baden. So with that being said, it's worth a read, but I'm really glad that the author goes into detail about what he testified to on the stand. A little note that I noticed at this part of the book in regards to the author. It was more so in the way that he writes. It was kind of interchanging. So in some paragraphs it was like that, in some it wasn't, but I couldn't really make some sense to it. And it was just the addressing of Dr. Baden or Dr. Spitz. And what I mean by that is in some paragraphs it would say, for example, Baden testified to what Spitz had said, instead of Dr. Baden and Dr. Spitz. Again, it wasn't like that every single time, but I thought maybe at first it was a typo for one of them, but then I noticed it happened a little bit more, but it was really just at this part of the book, and I wasn't sure why the author did that. I think that might not be a big deal to anybody. I'm just a bit old school, and anybody that knows me, I think outside of YouTube, knows that, to the point where like even my best friend's parents, even though we're all adults now with our own lives, I still refer to them as Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, even though that for decades they've been like, Danielle, stop it. But we're adults now. No, I'm And then I'm like, I can't call you by your first name. It's weird. It's just not respectful. So maybe I think I take that old school approach of Dr. Spitz and Dr. Bodden when I address them or think of addressing them. Again, not a deal breaker. It was just one of the things I noticed a few times. I was like, oh, that's interesting. The author did that. I wouldn't have done that. But again, that just might be my kind of old school mentality thinking. So after Dr. Bodden testified, he left. And as he was going to his car, John Byers followed him and they walked and talked. And the reason that you're saying, Danny, how do you know this? Well, the author was there. Again, when I say George Jared was boots on the ground, I mean George Jared was boots on the ground. And he actually got a picture of Dr. Bodden and John Byers chatting. And then after John Byers left, the author went up to Dr. Bodden, introduced himself, and asked his opinion. And when I got to this part of the book, I was just like, oh my God, what? I want to know. So what Dr. Bodden said to the author was, quote, I don't know what the hell is going on down here in Arkansas. This case is crazy. There's no way they did it. No way, end quote. And my note here to that is just a lot of exclamation points because I was just like, oh my gosh. I liked this in the book. And the author, again, as a reporter, he was there for this and was able to ask a lot of the main people in this case what their thoughts were during this time, like as it was unfolding. And that is so, not every person writing about the West Memphis 3 can do that. They weren't there. They did not have access in the same way that the author did to those involved in this case. We're going to get more of that as the book unfolds, but yeah, I find that like right away when he's like, I approached him, I want to get his opinions. Like, I just was like, I am not putting this book down. I need to know what Dr. Michael Bodden said, as well as everybody else that the author was able to approach and kind of ask those questions for. So, well, I just opened a can of worms that I don't think I can put the lid back on. I'm just going to pretend I didn't see either of those two comments, James Watson. So the author then talks about John Mark Byers, again, Christopher's adopted father. Many thought for years that he was the killer of the 3 boys. In the late 1990s, when there was a theory that the boys suffered human bites, John Byers actually removed his own teeth. I can't remember when I read this, I was like, did I know that before? Did I not? I couldn't remember. But the author makes the point to say, like, this didn't really help convincing people that he wasn't the killer for those who thought that he might have been. I mean, that's a very excellent point. The author says to him, so John could never have actually been a suspect as he was the oldest son and the wife accounted for his whereabouts during the time of the killings. Also, he was the first parent to call the police. The author goes on to say, quote, criminals do not call the police, end quote. So, okay, pause. I respectfully disagree with the author on this. Again, this book was written, it was copyright 2016. When the author started to put all of this together, I'm sure was, well before that. As the case was unfolding, true crime things have changed so much since then. My comment is, I wonder what the author's thoughts are on this now. Again, it was just one of those when I read that, I was like, George, you had me right up into your corner until you said this. And again, it could have been, again, a sign of the times. And that just wasn't done as much back then, or those who did it got away with it for the most part. But yeah, now we know that's just a totally different thing. But yeah, when I read that, my heart kind of sunk and I was like, George, no, how could you say that? But at the end of the day, I mean, that's his opinion as well. So who am I to say you're wrong? It was just like, it does happen. It does happen. And more frequently, sadly. But I digress. So the author then goes to talk about the markings that were on the victims. I'm not going to break down and specifically get into a lot of it because I know it is very graphic. And again, we are talking about 3 young boys. And I realize that there's a lot of things that we're talking about in this case that is, I'm trying to keep it as the least amount of graphic as I can. Because I know, as my audience, anything in regards to crime against children is it's a bit much, understandably, with this case, especially where it's been discussed so much at length. I feel like a lot of the little bits that I am talking about aren't overwhelming, but I'm really trying to make a conscious point to not be very specific and very detailed. But if you want to know more, the author does do a good job of explaining that in this book. But anyway, the bite marks from animals versus knife wounds. So that is kind of relating kind of the back and forth of, could it be this? Could it be that? And one of the things that the author relates to in this book is the Ted Bundy case and the bite mark in this case. The author, the same doctor that put Bundy away for his bite mark, Dr. Sovron, testified the West Memphis 3 case. So one of the things at this point in the book that I was very, very like, oh no. So the author discusses the victims of the Chi Omega house, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. The reason I paused for a second and said that incorrectly. So the author says Martha Bowman. He says Lisa Levy and Martha Bowman. It was not Martha Bowman. It was actually Margaret Bowman. He says that the 2 of them, so they shared a room, but they actually didn't share a room. I only know that because the Ted Bundy case is, as y'all know, is one of those cases that, like, as a child just kind of roped me into true crime. So it's one of those cases where I know, like, way too much about it than I should, especially at a young age. I knew way too much about it than I should. But again, does it relate to this case of the West Memphis 3? Not at all, except for the technology in regards to the bite marks on Lisa Levy, which that is accurate. And that actually is one of the things that did help put Bundy away for that crime, because they were able to match the dental impression marks to what was on Lisa to Ted Bundy. But again, when I saw he wrote Martha Bowman, I'm like, no, it's Margaret. And if you even say, well, maybe that was her nickname, and you look it up, no, it was Margaret. It was just Margaret Bowman. And again, her and Lisa did not share a room. They had their own. They had roommates. I believe Lisa's was out of town that weekend. I forget, but they did not. Margaret and Lisa specifically did not share a room with each other. But the author says they did. So side note, and that's just me being like, knowing that case, again, not a make or break and really not impacting the West Memphis 3 case. But I just wanted to, as I read that, I'm like, I just have to clarify because I have to get it off my chest. So anyway, okay, Dr. Janice, and I'm totally going to butcher this last name, Opaven, testified. So she was a pathologist who specialized in child death cases. She testified basically stating that no evidence was there that the boys were sodomized or forced to perform oral sex. That is huge, because for so long there were, and again, I feel like depending on what side you're kind of on with this case, with the evidence, even though I feel like a lot of the evidence kind of speaks for itself. But yeah, she's saying, no, someone who specializes in child death cases, again, there's no evidence the boys were sodomized or forced to perform oral sex. The author So not only was he boots on the ground, kind of outside of the courthouse, being able to talk to the people involved in this case, he was in the courtroom. He was in the courthouse during the trial. And not everybody is able to say that. And again, the author, and I'm just reiterating that just as a reminder to the viewer as you're listening to this review. Point being, because he was able to, one of the things he says at this particular point in the book was he was actually able to ask Jason and Jesse questions, and he would get answers from them. And he was actually surprised that the attorneys of them let them speak so freely to the press. Because remember, George Sherrod was a reporter. And that is mentioned in this book. He goes over, some of the questions that he had for them. And I just found that very fascinating. I mean, not everybody can say that they were there for this, boots on the ground in the courthouse, but certainly the small percentage that was there can't say, I actually was able to speak with them. Big difference. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there were witnesses who recanted later on. So we're going to start with Victoria Hutchinson. So the author discusses that when she came to court to recant her testimony that she gave during the 1994 trial, the author actually was able to speak with her in the hallway. She said she, quote, fabricated most of, end quote, her testimony in the first trial. She says, quote, I'm the reason he's been in jail for 15 years. It's my fault, end quote. I mean, yeah, I'm not going to be like, oh, you poor thing. Yeah. I can't overstate that enough. At the end of the day, are we glad that those who testified wrongly decided to recant? Yes, because they could have held on to that and just kept it to themselves. But again, coming forward doesn't mean you get a pass and, oh, it's okay. No, it's really not. But that's just me. The author doesn't say that. That's just me adding my 2 cents. Again, her quote was, I'm the reason he's been in jail for 15 years. It's my fault. So the author discusses, in regards to evidence, the knife being found on the lake near Jason's house. And that in itself is a huge thing because, quote, even our former reporter Stan thought that was peculiar. To find an item as small as a knife in a murky lake takes time, and it was perfectly placed. Media members were even told to stand in a certain spot to get the best pictures before the knife was found, end quote. I mean, yeah. And again, local media being told to stand there for when something that we're looking for and we don't know where it is, this is going to be the best shot to get. I mean, it's what's to even say they were going to find anything. They might not have, but no. I digress. I could go on for another 10 minutes ranting about that, but I won't. I want to, but I won't. So Pam Hobbs, so Stevie's mother. So on the day the author noticed Pam was in court sitting behind Jason and saying something to him. At first, Jason didn't know who she was. And what he noticed this woman say to Jason was she hoped he got a new trial. And then the author then learns who that in fact is, Pam Hobbs. And the author got to speak to Pam at lunch recess, and he asked her, what did you say to Jason? And she said, quote, I told him if it's God's will, you'll get a new trial, end quote. Let's make note that Pam initially despised Damien, Jason, Jesse, the West Memphis Three. But Pam eventually suspected Terry Hobbs, her estranged husband, as possibly being involved in the death and murders of the 3 boys, one being her son. She gave her son Stevie a pocket knife, and he kept it with him basically at all times. When he went missing, the knife was never recovered. In 2003, Pam's sister actually found the knife. It was on Terry's nightstand. Another thing, so Terry was actually never questioned in the original investigation, which I know we can go a lot into detail about how the original investigation was handled. But you would think that, I mean, what is like interviewing 101? You start with immediate close friends, family, whatnot, and then you work your way out. So I don't know how that was. No, it just, on the one hand, I'm like, am I shocked? No, but should the parents been questioned in this case? Yeah, they should have. So we're going to jump to 2007. DNA collected from a hair that was entwined in the shoelace that bound Michael was linked to Terry. In addition, in December 2007, a support rally was held. This is one that I feel like so many, kind of as the celebrities start to come forward and give their support to the West Memphis Three, as I kind of start to say these things, you're gonna be like, oh, I remember that. I remember that. Well, the one I'm specifically referring to is December 2007, when the Dixie Chicks lead singer Natalie Maine spoke, and she actually said the killer was Terry Hobbs. In 2007, where was I? I was in college. I kind of vaguely remember that. Because I was like completely like in my studies, in my working full time, paying for school as I went, involved in like, extracurricular activities, dance team, dance clubs. I was so involved in like what I was doing on campus and with schooling that it's like, I remember when that happens, but then I was also like too busy to really get in depth. So like point being, rereading it, I was like, oh, that's right. And it brought me back to where I was in life. Oh, I was at school. I was, doing this. And I remember the specific semester that happened. Yeah. So kind of a bit of a blast from the past. It just puts me back to where I was in time when this was kind of all kind of unfolding with, again, a lot of celebrities kind of showing their support. So as you can imagine, Natalie making a claim just so publicly saying Terry Hobbs was the killer, Terry responded by filing a defamation suit against her. He lost the lawsuit. However, the lawsuit was the first time Terry actually had to ever give his whereabouts and an account of where he was that day. And that was huge, because his own words actually increased suspicion of him as what could be the killer. Terry said he was searching with Dana Moore and John Mark Byers. Dana and John, however, told police Terry was never there. He was not present at all at that time. And John went so far as to say Terry was a liar. Terry's whereabouts from 5:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. on that evening that the boys went missing cannot be accounted for. So the author makes it a point to talk a bit more at this point, because that's when we're now, through Terry's own words, learning more about him. And it was alleged that he was using cocaine, weed, and meth in the past. The author goes on to describe his relationship with Stevie, and it was really not a good one. It was really heartbreaking to read about that. Terry would beat Stevie, and it wasn't just like a one-time thing, and it wasn't just like a punishment. It went beyond. It really went beyond. So it's just so heartbreaking, because it just really went to show that Stevie just wasn't very protected in life. And what I mean by that is, as a parent or parental figure, like that's who, like as a child, like that's your safe place, your parents. They're supposed to shelter you from the world. And when that parental figure is inflicting and causing so much physical abuse, and with the physical abuse comes the mental abuse, and I'm sure there was verbal abuse. I'm just guessing. Do not quote me. It just breaks my heart. It breaks my heart how Stevie lived with that, but then also how he died. And yeah, it's heartbreaking. The book also goes a step further, and this was something I made a note here, and I'm like, I don't think I knew this. There was alleged sexual abuse between Terry and actually his own daughter, Amanda. There are journal entries from Amanda that are in this book. And again, I don't believe I knew that before reading this book. So when I was kind of reading through her entries, I was just like, oh, shit. Okay. So that is the type of person, as the book unfolds and as the author learns more about Terry to put in this book, we're learning just who he really is. What can I say, y'all? You guys took totally different stances on that little story in time that I just did. Totally different stances. And I'm not surprised by either one of you. So the book discusses Mildred French. She actually lived next door to Terry. I was just like, this woman, like, good for her. Good for her. So she actually gave a sworn deposition to police that he broke into her house, and she was there when she got out of the shower and he grabbed at her breasts. She screamed because she thought he was going to rape and kill her, and he fled. Mildred filed a police report. Terry denied the accusations. The landlord ended up terminating Terry's lease. He moved. And this is where the system breaks down. He was never sentenced to jail in connection with the attack, but he was charged with misdemeanor assault and criminal trespass. I'm like, how can you give him one and not the other? It blows my mind. And he was court ordered to attend counseling. I mean, talk about like a slap on the wrist. I mean, I did not know this before reading this book as well. So I was just like, all right, so there is a pattern with Terry, and an escalating pattern with Terry. And I know someone might be watching this saying, well, Danny, just because someone's done X, Y, and Z does not mean that they've done, the other thing that they're being. You are correct. It does not always mean, but sometimes it does. So the book discusses Michael Hobbs Jr., Terry's nephew, stating that his uncle was the killer. So Michael Hobbs was, so he basically was playing pool in a basement with his friends. And he says he overheard his uncle and dad talking about the murders, and he overheard Terry, his uncle, admitting that he was involved. Michael Hobbs Jr. ended up kind of telling his friends what he heard, so on and so forth. So again, a family member saying that his uncle was the killer. So kind of, again, this is one of those things where as a reader, I'm like, could it be one thing? Could it be the other? Possibly. But that is not all. John Byers ended up suspecting Terry as well. John stated how Terry was angry when John wouldn't say that Terry was with him at 6 p.m. That's not a normal reaction, and that's not the kind of approach you want to take on someone when you're trying to get them to give you an alibi. Not that I'm trying to give advice to somebody on how to commit crime and get away with it, but that's very interesting. It's very interesting because if you didn't do it, why would you need to lie about your alibi and get mad when people aren't playing along to lie with you for your alibi? Like it says a lot, right? Quote, several years ago, I was talking to Hobbs, and he made the statement that we met for the first time around 6 p.m. on May 5th, 1993. I told him, no, it was around 8 p.m. He became enraged and started yelling, it was 6 p.m. It was 6 p.m. I believe he was trying to convince me that it was 6 p.m. so that he would have an alibi. And the fact that I knew he was lying sent him into a rage, end quote. What a powerful, powerful statement from John Byers, right? I think it says it all. So the author goes on to note that Terry Hobbs stated that in 2007, he saw a black man, one he called a bum, crossing the bridge near Catfish Island while he and Pam searched. He claimed that he and his wife saw this long-haired, ragged-clothed man. The thing is, Pam denied ever seeing this person. So again, if he's saying, here's this person we both saw, but the other person that's crucial to that alibi is saying, no, we didn't see someone like that. Not good either, too. John Byers thinks it's strange. It took Hobbs 14 years to give what could have been a key detail in that case. So point being, if that story that Hobbs just gave about that person was correct, why'd you wait 14 years to tell police? That could have been like the key to solving this case. Doesn't make sense. It does not make sense. I mean, I think it's bullshit, that story, but that's just me. So the author talks about how his encounters with Ken Arnold went, and we're going to get more into that because if you're thinking, wait, who is Ken Arnold? The jury foreman in the Eccles and Baldwin trial. Ironically, the author and Ken basically went to the same gym at that time. So the defense spent years trying to prove that Ken Arnold committed jury misconduct by introducing Justy's confession to the other jurors during their deliberation. So the book does go a little bit into what specifically those accusations were, and then kind of Ken's recollection of that. But nonetheless, the author was able to speak with his encounters with Kent because, yeah, they went to the same gym. Small world, right? So the book then goes on to discuss the filming and release of Paradise Lost, which I feel like anybody who knows this case has seen Paradise Lost, or maybe you didn't watch it knowing the case, but you watch it because everybody was watching Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost was called The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills in 1996, and the police's reactions to it. That is what the book then goes into. And now with the release of Paradise Lost, the West Memphis 3 movement was in full force at that time. There was 2 more that came out, Paradise Lost 2 Revelations and Paradise Lost 3 Purgatory. The author discusses he was actually interviewed for Paradise Lost 3, but the directors never used the footage of the interview in their film. I did not know that the author was interviewed for the 3rd one, but that makes a lot of sense. The author, again, boots on the ground. He was there for this as it unfolded. He's from that area. So who better to interview than someone who was there and knows this in his community, right? So the author was invited to a viewing party of CBS's airing of 48 Hours Mystery episode where the case was looked at with new evidence that was the central focus at that time. And it was at this premiere party where the author got to meet Lori Eccles. She told him she could arrange an interview with the author and with Damien. After the show, speakers made their way to the podium and the author, George Jared, was asked to speak. He told the crowd the best way to push the case forward was to pressure the Arkansas Attorney General, Dustin McDaniel. Let's see, I have a note here. Say that the author was... Okay, yeah, my note was I didn't realize that the author was there at that premiere. Was actually asked to speak, so I thought that was pretty cool. The author did get that interview with Damien, as Lori had mentioned. The author, prior to the interview, had dinner the night before with Lori. He discusses their conversation, how it went over his first, her first communications with Damien, the relationship that Lori and Damien had. how it blossomed, how they ultimately got married, and her telling her friends and family about Damien. Those are all interesting things, and especially like the part where like, yeah, how would your friends and family react? And I thought that was really cool that the author kind of got to have that kind of intimate conversation with Lori and then kind of share that with his audience. The author, again, you know how I said earlier was one of the things I appreciate about this author is that he's very much a straight shooter. This part of the book is that he goes to say, he flats out tells Lori and says to her, like, how many people thought she was crazy or a calculating opportunist to marry someone who is internationally famous and on death row as an inmate. Lori, at first when I read that, I'm like, George, oh my God. But then I'm like, but that's who he is. Like, and you got to appreciate that. Lori's response, I mean, I love Lori, love Lori. She is just, she's just one of those powerful women who just brings more good to the world than most. Her response cleared those false ideas. And she said, she explained their relationship to the author. I'm not going to put that in this review because I want everybody to read it. But my note is I found this one of the best parts of the book as well, and really interesting. So, hello, Sam Smith, coming into the chat. Welcome. I mean, in regards to this case, I don't blame you for thinking that, hun. All right. So the author talks about going to the prison to meet with Damien in person and the steps of going through all the security checkpoints and then his first seeing Damien and meeting him. And the author really breaks all of those things I just said down. I just recapped it into one sentence, but no, the author does a great job of breaking it down because we as everyday people don't go to prison and go through those checkpoints to meet with a famous inmate on death row. But the author got that opportunity and was able to, like, here's what that was like. And I found that very fascinating because, again, not everybody can have that perspective. Let's see. The author discusses when he met with Damien, family, growing up in poverty on the edge of town, Damien's lack of education, and most importantly, the day that the boys went missing. Damien went with his family to a pharmacy to pick up a prescription. He then met up with his friend Jason Baldwin. After Jason got home from school at 3:30 p.m., they played video games and talked on the phone. At 5 p.m., they both went to Jason's uncle's house to mow his yard. The uncle gave a sworn statement cooperating to this part of the story as well. He claimed Jason mowed the lawn, but he wasn't alone. Damien discussed Jesse's confession when he met with the author. Jesse and Damien knew each other, but they weren't necessarily friends. Damien discusses with the author, and this is just kind of heartbreaking. His first few days in county jail were really hard. He wrote a suicide note to his family and to his girlfriend, who was actually pregnant with his child. On January 9th, 1993 at 9 p.m., Damien did attempt to kill himself. He was taking prescription medications and secretly stashed them under his table each night instead of taking them as prescribed. So again, kind of building up a large quantity, took them, tried to kill himself by taking them all at once, but he actually survived the attempt. When Damien had to appear in court, he talks about that with the author, how the victims' families screamed and yelled at him. And Damien responded, again, always hindsight's 2020, but he would curse and sneer at them. And of course, these responses were very public and made more so public by the media. The author says, quote, "It was overhyped by the media," end quote. There were photographs that showed him with a demonic rage-filled stare. But the author adds, and many people don't know this, at one point that there's a particular photo of Damien that has that demonic rage-filled glare. Damien was actually hit in the back of the head with a rock just before this image was taken. And the author states that a reporter who covered the original trials confirmed that to him as well, that the rock incident did occur. In the original trial, the defense attorneys didn't establish Damien's alibi. They never called Jennifer Bearden to the stand to testify, even though they talked on the phone 3 times that afternoon and that night. In prison, after Damien was in fact found guilty, he was beaten by inmates, sexually assaulted, and tortured. And that was not just by the inmates. The guards also attacked him as well. At this part in the book, I make a note. So 124 pages in, the author states he wants to cover something more important in his stories. So what he wanted to do, the author, was, he says, to help expose the inept justice system that led to Damien's incarceration in the first place. Quote, but it had to be done through an objective and unbiased lens, end quote. The author goes on to say, quote, as time passed, as more facts came to light, it was increasingly harder to be objective, end quote. The author flat out says to the reader that this case was a justice system tragedy. And I really like that the author waits as long as he did to put this in the book, because then we got earlier in the book a bit of where the author's mindset was. So you kind of knew that at some point in the book. But the author, again, what I like is he's relaying everything to the reader kind of in real time as he's covering this case, as it's developing, as more research, as more information is coming out. And as he's saying, it's getting harder to be objective with what is being put out. But he also is saying it had to be done through an objective and unbiased lens. I cannot understate how important of a quote that was in this book, especially at this part in this book, because as a reader, you, regardless of which way you kind of stand on the West Memphis tree, whether you think they were innocent, they were not, regardless, you get to this point and you hear what the author's saying, and you know that, okay, here's where the author's opinion is, but you've seen where the author's laid out the book in a very factual way so far. And you know that when he says this is going to have to be done through an objective and unbiased lens, you know, okay, this is the way the author is going to continue carrying out this book. And I respect that. And that's one of the things that I really like about this book. You get a little bit of his opinions here and there, but he's doing what a true reporter does, and is a true good reporter does, in just kind of relaying everything as it's unfolding. And then, yeah, the author will say what he thinks later on, but for right now, no, he's just laying it out for the reader. And there's something to be said for that. And it doesn't always happen. And I appreciate as a reader when the authors make a artistic choice to do that. So, okay. The author, again, continues talking about his meeting with Damien in person in prison. And Damien's message to the author was simple, yet it was overwhelming throughout the interview. He wanted every single piece of evidence tested. And think about that. It sounds so like, well, okay, well, why not? If someone was really guilty and the evidence was going to prove that, they're not going to consistently argue, test it. There might be some that might, to initially throw suspicion off them if they think they can get away with it. That's a whole nother thing in itself. But in this case, all the West Memphis 3, they were just like, no, test it. It's not going to show. It's going to show it's not us. And yeah, message was simple. One of the things that the author does throughout the book in discussing DNA, my note here is also he does a great job in discussing DNA technology testing and advancing throughout the decades. And that's one thing that you kind of hear the author kind of describe as the book unfolds, what DNA testing was like at the time of each piece of evidence kind of being examined and looked at. Because again, it's 2026 right now. DNA testing is way advanced, like so much further along than it was back during this original trial. So I feel like readers now need to, or even like in 2016 when this book was published, I mean, DNA has come in 10 years, such a huge way too. But again, it's just kind of taking a step back and not looking at it through current lenses of where DNA technology is, but to remember back to what it was. Okay. When it finally got to the mid-2000s, DNA technology and testing became a phenomenon across the country, but it was still at its early phases. There were some suspects who begged to have evidence in their cases tested and others who didn't. Take that as you will. The testing that was happening so early at this time did lead to some inmates being released and being freed because the evidence showed it was not them. Another note I have here in this part of the book, one part of the book that I really liked was the author discussing, all right, he also talked about other stories that he wrote while working at The Sun, his employer. And in these stories, he interwove Damien's personal reflections into the case. So yeah, that was an interesting part of the book as well. Because at first I was like, okay, why is the author kind of, we're at such an important part right now of his meeting with Damien and all of these things are happening in DNA. And then he's bringing up these other cases. But at first I wasn't sure where it was going, but then I could see how it was, again, kind of being interwoven with Damien's personal reflections in the case and kind of what was happening at the time. And then it made perfect sense. And then I ended up really liking that part of the book. So the author describes how overwhelmingly there were different responses to the articles that he was publishing about this case, which makes a lot of sense, right? I can't even imagine how huge the divide was back then, because the divide is still pretty decent now. But anyway, the author talks about how there were some supporters who contacted him with emails and letters. There were some subscribers to the place where he worked that actually canceled their subscriptions. And the author's publisher made sure that all the controversial comments reached George, the author. The publisher would go even so far as to say he believed the West Memphis 3 were guilty. And it's at that moment that the author realizes that many in the Northeast Arkansas area, no matter how tangled up that the facts in this case were, they still believed that the police and prosecution convicted the right 3 men. The author talks about how he asked Damien's he was asked by Damien's public relations team to attend the support rally that was held in Little Rock. Remember that photo I showed you earlier of Johnny Depp? Yeah, that is a photo that the author took. The author did go. He was accompanied by his wife. He went as on his own time, at his own expense, to attend the rally. He discusses how he got to meet several celebrities that were there in attendance, as well as the author got to be interviewed. He got to meet Natalie Maines, Eddie Vedder, again, Damien's wife, Lori, who he'd already met before, Dan Stidham. And during the concert, he got a picture of Johnny Depp pointing and smiling at him. And the author recounts this concert and what it was like being there in all aspects. I mean, because think about it, the author just wasn't there as an attendee to kind of see this, to be there for the supportive concert, see these celebrities. The author had such a different perspective being there and seeing it through his lens that nobody else in attendance can really have that same perspective. So for the author to discuss this the way that he did, it was, my note here is that this was one of the coolest parts of the book, because the author isn't getting wrapped up in the celebrity of it all. He really isn't. He's meeting these people, but the conversations he's having with them about the West Memphis 3 men and the injustice and what needs to be done, it was really, really cool to read that. And again, I really want to make note of it. He was not there being starstruck. He does kind of think it was cool that Johnny Depp kind of pointed at him, which I'll give him that. I mean, yeah, come on. But everything else, like the conversations he had with these other celebrities were just real and authentic about the issue at hand. And that was not lost. And it was, again, to me, one of the coolest parts of the book, reading that section. Now, we're going to jump ahead in time. It was early fall, and the case was to go before the Arkansas Supreme Court. Arguments were made on September 30th, 2010, beginning for Damien, Jesse, and Jason's fate. The state case was that the prosecutors admitted some of the new DNA evidence might basically cause people to change their mind. DNA recovered from the crime scene was not of the three men. They tried to argue that the prosecution tried to argue that just because their DNA wasn't recovered doesn't mean they weren't involved. Therefore, none of the new evidence proved their innocence, and therefore couldn't be used as the basis to grant a new trial. On the flip side, the argument was that the new evidence, along with the already known facts of the case, would create doubt in the mind of a reasonable jury. In the end, the Arkansas Supreme Court rejected a new trial for Damien, Jesse, and Jason. But that was not to be the end. On November 4th, 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court remanded the case back to the circuit court. An evidentiary hearing was ordered, and a new judge would consider whether the new DNA and forensic evidence merited retrials. And juror misconduct allegations would also be vetted. And this, at the time, was huge. And I remember when this happened, it was like, wait, what? But again, I was still doing my thing. So I wasn't as following, like, for example, as I do now with cases. But nonetheless, I remember when that happened, because like everybody went crazy. Like, this could be it. This could be it. That they could finally maybe get a real trial, right? So the author discusses that while he waited for this to happen, because these types of things take time, he wrote about the case, and he received hundreds, if not thousands, of responses. And it was a mix of responses. People supporting the three men, others thinking they were child killers and that they were guilty, and that the first verdict was the right verdict. Hello, Kat. So much speculation in this case. Was DNA taken from the victim's father figures? I don't 100% know the answer on that, so I don't want to misstate. Oh, was it tested? I discussed earlier about some of the DNA evidence on the ligature matching one of the fathers. So that might answer your question. But yeah, but that I discussed that way back because that was a lot earlier in the book. Okay. August 18th, 2011. So the three men had court: Jason, Jesse, and Damien. The author found out through a series of phone calls where actually too much information was given to him that should not have been, that they were actually going to be released. These three men were going to be released the next day. And when you read this, you feel where the author is finding this out and is like stopped in his tracks. Like, wait, what? John Mark Byers was actually the one that told the author and basically laid it all out. The deal included all three men, which led to them being released. No, Kat, no. All good. See, that's why my reviews are so long, because I talk about like every part in the book. But no, it is discussed earlier on. But yeah, do not apologize. So the news editor where the author worked had told the author, George Jared, to hold off on putting out a story until another news outlet reported it. And the author says how mad he was hearing that. And I felt that as a reader. I felt pissed on the author's behalf. It's like, wait a minute. I've been boots on the ground. This is just me recapping the author in my mind. He's boots on the ground doing all of these things. He is there. This is community. This is him. And the editor's like, no, let somebody else do it first before we do. Was there going to be backlash? Yes, that's what, and it's not any fault of the author. It's what the case was. There was going to be backlash of people who were like, no, the guilty verdict was the right verdict. They are the killers, so on and so forth. But then there's so many that are like, no, they were innocent. Look at the way the trial was done. Look at what the evidence says. Look at the people who recanted their statements, so on and so forth. And it's like that with any case. You can't have it both ways. So I was very mad on the author's behalf when I read that, where the news editor was like, you can write the story, but you basically can't put it out till somebody else does. Like, oh my gosh, that bothered me. And it bothered the author too, rightfully so. So anyway, the author talks about how that night, the night that the information was released that the guys were going to be let out the next day. So we're talking about the night before. A huge television boom truck was already in the parking lot of the courthouse. It was the same courthouse where so many of these hearings took place. And the author says, quote, I remembered being the only reporter in the courtroom at times to cover the story. The biggest newsmaker in the world would break it in that same courthouse the next day, end quote. Just the beginning of that quote from the author really, I think it just really goes to show how far back the author goes with this case, that he remembers being the only reporter in the courtroom at times covering this story. And again, that I just think that says it all. I think it says it all. But yeah, and now it's going to be one of those not only nationwide, but international things, and people were lining up to get there. Speaking of lining up to get there, so the author then discusses the next day. So the day the men were going to be in court, there were thousands of supporters rallied outside the courthouse. The author was in the courtroom that day. Also in the courtroom were Lori Eccles and Eddie Vedder and Natalie Means. At one point, Damien, Jason, and Jesse entered the courtroom. The new evidence, what the author says is basically all the new evidence and showed their innocence, and it really could no longer be ignored. It was extremely overwhelming. All three men took an Alford plea, and the judge accepted the Alford pleas, sentencing them to time served plus 10 years probation. And the author makes it a point to put this caveat in there, and I'm really glad the author does, because not everybody is familiar with an Alford plea. And if you're not, I think you're going to have so many questions of, well, what about this, or why not this? But the author makes it a point to say, since the Alford plea is technically a guilty plea, the men couldn't sue the state for wrongful imprisonment. And again, there might be so many people that have questions of, well, why did they take the plea, and so on and so forth. Even to this date, like, that's not what this book is about. There are other books that discuss like the pros and cons of whatnot. I think a lot of it speaks for itself, but the book here, this particular book that we're reviewing today, doesn't get into that. But yeah, if you are not familiar with an Alford plea, because we don't see it that much, to be honest, it's worth doing a little bit of research on just to educate, because it's absolutely fascinating, but it's also frustrating too, especially in a case like this. So outside the courthouse, the author saw John Mark Byers finishing an interview with a television crew. And the author says as he approached, he noticed Terry Hobbs lingering near the courthouse doorway. So the author asks John, quote, so John, if these three men didn't kill your son and the other boys, who did, end quote. John's head swung around and he eyed Terry. And John said, quote, Terry Wayne Hobbs, that son of a bitch right over there. I don't think he did it. I know he did, end quote. Terry scampered away to the other side of the building. What a statement. What a statement. And the author was there to get that. Because again, the author's been there since before all the other reporters were there. So he has a rapport. He's from Arkansas. He knows the community. But yeah, I was like, okay, John, let's, I love that. I love that. Just don't hold back. Anyway, so DNA evidence, especially the hairs, is part of what convinced John Byers of Terry Hobbs' guilt. Quote, they didn't get there by osmosis. He can't explain that. He can't tell the same lie twice, end quote. Powerful, powerful quote. So the author says at this point, he goes back to the office and ends up writing the longest article he has ever written. And in the aftermath, more witnesses recanted their stories from the first trial. Damien, Jason, and Jesse now started their new lives outside of jail. So the author then, towards the end of the book, as we kind of wrap up this review, goes on to say some very spot on and actually very powerful things, I would say. The author says, and I really like this because it just really shows, I think, where his intentions are. He says, I can't say anyone is innocent or guilty without having witnessed the events in person. Quote, no journalist worth his or her salt should ever have a declarative opinion without incontrovertible proof, end quote. The evidence easily leads to the conclusion that Damien Eccles, Jesse Miskelly Jr. and Jason Baldwin didn't end those boys' lives. And I have heard so many other people in the field, like the one that pops in my mind is Joseph Scott Morgan, who is does the podcast Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. And he, in his career, which if you guys aren't following him, I mean, I've talked about his podcast a million times, definitely check it out. But he always says statements like that, like no forensic examiner worth his or her salt should say or do X, Y, and Z's. It's more so especially say. And so to hear the author or read the author say like things like this that are kind of in line with that type of thinking, I'm like, yes, like, thank you. Thank you. And I really appreciate that because it's so easy for us to say like, well, what do you mean you can't say if they did it or not? Or if you think they did it or not, you've been there this whole time. You kind of, and he's saying just flat out like, here's why. Here's why. I'm obsessed with his explanation for here's why. There should be more people that take that same approach to the here's why. Anyway, the author discusses, at this point of the book, kind of moves on from the West Memphis 3, but still keeping in context with false confessions, discusses a few other cases where there were false confessions and discusses how as time has evolved and DNA testing has evolved, those advancements helped show that the people who made those false confessions didn't commit the crimes. And in regards to when I say false confessions, there's a variety of reasons that someone gives a false confession. And sadly, we're still at a point in time where those things still happen, whether there's mental health at play, whether there is coercion from police to do that. There's a lot of different, sometimes it's for the fame and notoriety, which is really sick and disgusting, but we've seen that as well. So there's a variety of reasons. But the good thing is, and the author makes it a point to say that because of advancements in technology, sometimes those false confessions, for whatever the reason, can now be shown, hey, you know what, the person really didn't do it. They're confessing for whatever the reason is, but they didn't really do it. At the end of the book, the author tells the reader what he thinks happened to the boys who were killed in the West Memphis 3 case. What I like is he waits till the very, very, very end and then does a like very loosely like, here's my opinion, but also not saying, here's what happened. Because again, he's saying, I wasn't there. I can't say that. But it's one of those, if I had to look at, here's my opinion. And again, big difference between opinion and fact. There's no, here's what happened. It's, here's what I think based on this. In regards to what he thinks happened, I'm not going to tell you. Get the book and read it and find out. I know I'm so mean. I'm so mean. All right. So the very, very end of the book after that, if you think that's where the book ends, no, it does not. The author does a really great job. You know how at the beginning of the book he discussed, and I'm going to show her picture again because it needs to be shown. Rebecca Gould. He discusses this case and kind of what that writing that case for his and his point in his career kind of then led to the West Memphis 3. The author then gets to the end of the book and brings in another case, and that is the case of 11-year-old Jessica Williams and her murder. The author covered this case in August 2013. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. But I really, again, at first when I thought, what an interesting artistic choice to discuss a different case at the beginning. I mean, he tied it in so it made sense. I really liked that he then brought in another case at the end. And it just, I really like that he brought attention to 2 more cases. In a very minimal way where the readers get a lot of information and then can continue to look it up more on their own. But I really, really liked that. I wasn't expecting that at the end. When I was reading through, I was just like, okay, he talked about the case where Damien, Jason, and Jesse are now as of 2016. And then again, the author kind of very loosely, you know, based on X, Y, and Z, here's what I think. Thinking the book was going to end there, and it didn't. And I was very pleasantly surprised. I really liked being educated on 2 cases that are from that area that I wouldn't have ordinarily have learned about. So that is, I was hoping to do it under 2 hours. I'm just under 2 hours. But yeah, that is my review of the book from George Jared again, which is in West Memphis, the West Memphis 3, and Another False Confession. So what I liked about this book is it's a short book. So it's easy to read. With that being said, the author puts a lot into each chapter. So you're getting thrown a lot of information about the case, about the people in the case, about the author in regards to himself, where he is at this point in writing it. So, and I mean that in a good way. So each chapter is very, very condensed. If you're familiar with this case, you're going to follow along very easily. If you're not familiar with this case, I think you might have to read it at a bit of a slower pace just to keep up, because there are so many people involved in this case. But with that being said, as I said earlier, their author does a great way of letting everybody who's involved in this case, kind of their stories be in here as well. So you really get to know who they are, their part in this, who they are in relation to whoever's being discussed in this case, so on and so forth. So as you read it, you're going to be like, okay, so this, I know who I'm reading about, and now they're interacting with this person, and the author's going to inform me about that. So yeah, if you're not familiar with this case, I think it might take you a little bit longer to read just to get caught up with everybody involved, but that's not a bad thing. Again, there were very interesting artistic choices that were made by the author that were quite different. At first, as a reader, I was a little unsure, but then as the book unfolded, and especially as I've gone through it twice now and reflected on it, they were very different, but very interesting and unique, good artistic choices. Again, having the photos of the 2 girls, one at the beginning of the book, one at the end of cases that he also wrote about, having their photo there just really made it just ties it in, because it's one thing to see a name on a page and be like, well, it might not hit you the same way as you look at a photo of them and their eyes are looking right at you through the picture. It's like, okay, I'm invested now. There was a few typos that I mentioned, or not even typos, but like spacing, like the little things that if I had to critique. And then to me, the big one was like again, Ted Bundy's victims with saying Lisa and Margaret were roommates. They were not. And then calling Margaret Martha, which she was not known as Martha, but did not make or break this by any means. What really kind of stood out to me was, again, the author's unique place in this book. Again, there are so many books about the West Memphis 3. None of them can give this perspective that the author does. He was there. He's from the community, boots on the ground. And again, says it so just accurately, where there were times he was the only reporter in the courthouse covering this. And now, like, you know, towards the end, when like it had the circus media that it was very different. But for him to be able to say, like, and look back at like how it changed, how it evolved, and the movement and all of that, and just how he was present for all of that and was still just so matter of fact through it. It's such a cool, unique experience, and especially one to read about, because again, you're not going to get that from another book on this case. So I'm really glad that I got to read that. And I'm honestly very honored that I got to meet the author at Beyond the Crime and chat with him about the book and just chat with him in general. Very, very cool guy. So yeah, I definitely recommend this book. So long story short, if you have read the book and you weren't able to be here for the live review, leave a comment. I would love to chat with you about this. Or if you're like, hey, I'm going to pick it up too, and awesome, let me know what your thoughts are when you read it. If you have a different takeaway than I do, because as much as I do my long book reviews, I can't capture everything. So there might be something that you took away from it that I wasn't able to mention in this that really stuck out for you. And I would really love to discuss that. Yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed this. And again, thank you guys for voting for this for the book club selection for the month of May. I will post a poll in a couple of days with the next kind of book ideas for June. And then, yeah, we can vote and go from there. So everybody enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you for those who were here tonight that stuck around for this long review. PJ Wolf, I believe the 3 didn't do it. Sam Smith, I love when you come and drop in facts. I love it. No, and they never will. They absolutely never will. We're in 2026. Never will. Yeah, that would be like one of those hell would have to freeze over type of things. But then again, to be fair, let me go back to that. You can't. Because think about it, if a prosecutor says, I knew what I was doing, I knew they didn't do it, and I went, like, that just opens the floodgates for like so many other things. So it's like, it's never going to happen. Sadly, and we see this with so many cases, corruption, they kind of go down swinging. They go down swinging. We could do a whole nother hour chat on that, but it's a work night, so let's not do that. All right, everybody. Thank you again who were here for this review. Thank you for anybody who's watching it on replay. Anybody has any questions or comment on the book, leave it in the comments below and I will definitely get back to you. So until next time, everybody, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us. Bye, everyone.